No, that position, as articulated and described by the Chinese ambassador to the US, is inaccurate. And the reason being is that countries like Australia are part and parcel of this region. Furthermore, the United States has been part and parcel of this region since it was called upon by regional countries to deal with Japanese aggression during the Second World War. And so for those reasons, I don't think it passes logical muster. And furthermore, China's own military expansion creates its own dynamic within the region. So I think whatever controversies exist concerning the way in which the submarine deal has been done by the Australian government, and there are many of those, I don't think the critique offered by China's representative to the US is valid.
Could it get support, though, from countries that we've been developing relationships with in the region?
Across East Asia and the West Pacific, there is a high degree of scepticism about Chinese official policy concerning China's own military expansion. If you look at the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy, the Chinese PLA Air Force, and other, as it were, units of Chinese forces, including its Coast Guard and its activities in the South China Sea and beyond, across the Indo-Pacific in the case of the Navy, then regional countries have their own level of scepticism about China's own strategic intentions. So as I said, it's important that Australians separately evaluate the way in which this submarine deal has been done and what it proposes to do. But frankly, China's critique on these questions do not pass logical muster.
Yeah. Let's talk to China's pivot to this notion of common prosperity. We've seen a series of state interventions in industries from tech to gaming to private tutors. You argue that this signifies a new age in Chinese communism, the third age in Chinese communism. What is that going to look like?
Well, since the 19th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party in 2017, you see a series of new Marxist-Leninist conceptual frameworks emerge for the way in which China sees its own economic policy. Xi Jinping, in the last year or so, has grouped those under the rubric of the new development concept. And you see now that as the umbrella term, almost replacing the older term we're all familiar with, which is China's age of reform and opening. And then within this new development concept, you see two other ideas as well, the so-called dual circulation economy, which is Chinese code language for greater and greater degrees of national self-reliance. And on the other side of the new development concept is this parallel concept of common prosperity. And that is about a more radical and interventionist approach by the Chinese state towards income redistribution. And all these things represent substantive change from the China we've known for the last 35 years.
And when you talk about this shift in economic settings, you know, the decoupling from the US, and to your point, this focus on the domestic economy rather than dependence on exports, that could be disastrous, couldn't it, for the global economy?
Well, if you look carefully at China's new strategy of the dual circulation economy, it basically says China's future growth model will be principally driven by its own domestic market and much less so by net exports. Now, it doesn't rule out the future of the traded sector of the economy. It will still be important, but not as important. More importantly, if you read the subtext of what the Chinese government and party are saying about this dual circulation economy, is that the domestic market is much more important than exports. And when it comes to future imports into China, that China should use those imports to leverage its own position with those countries who become increasingly dependent on China as a market. So it's reasonably mercantilist in the way in which it's constructed.
Yeah. Does it jeopardise, you know, what's happening in China? There's billions of dollars that have been wiped off values of various companies. Does it jeopardise China's growth and China's stability?
This, I believe, is the $6,000 question, if you'll pardon the pun, which is what happens in terms of the size of China's economic growth in the future, and in turn, the reverberations of any decrease in China's growth rate for the global economy, which has become accustomed to its own growth being powered by China's economic engine room. So if you aggregate all these shifts to the left on Chinese domestic economic policy, the new development concept, the dual circulation economy, common prosperity, etc., you've got to ask yourself this question: is there a real risk that what Xi Jinping is doing is beginning to suffocate the animal spirits of the Chinese private sector, which have largely powered Chinese growth for the last 35 years? And remember, the private sector, as of a year or so ago, represented 60% of Chinese GDP. It's not a small fraction of activity, it's very big. But this is a big experiment, and the growth consequences, a big question mark should be attached to it. But I think global economists will be watching very carefully the flow-through effect of these new policy settings on real growth numbers.
Yeah. It is interesting too what impact it's going to have on Xi Jinping himself. You know, he is cracking down on values and really determining how people should think and behave in China. He wants to be in power much longer. Could you see people turning on him down the track?
Well, these recent shifts in Chinese economic policy, really since the 19th Party Congress in 2017, and unfolding more intensively since then, come to a head with the 20th Party Congress scheduled for November 2022. And that's when Xi Jinping will be up for his own reappointment for a record-breaking third term, when normally his predecessors have been limited to 2 terms only. At a different level, these shifts to the left in economic policy have also been mirrored earlier in Xi Jinping's political office by parallel movements to the left in Chinese politics. There is much greater assertion of the power of the party, a greater series of restrictions on freedom of speech, of cultural expression, even, frankly, China's LGBTQ community facing new restrictions as well. So these things tend to accumulate. Can they actually form together and bring about a general level of political resistance to Xi Jinping's reappointment? Possibly. But if I was a betting man at this stage, which I'm not, a year out from the 20th Party Congress, Xi Jinping is a master Machiavellian and politician. He's currently running a purge within the party. His likelihood of reappointment is still very strong.
It is funny, Kevin, because you think about Australia and whether we're ever going to restore our relationship with them, and you just realise with this shift going on that we're insignificant to him.
Not entirely. Australia is seen within the Asia-Pacific region as a significant country. Basically, in China's hierarchy of states, if you like, is seen from Beijing's lens. Countries such as Japan and the Republic of Korea are of immense importance because of proximity and history. But in terms of aggregate economic size, they then begin to look to countries like India and Australia. And Australia looms within Asia as the 4th or 5th largest economy, and therefore not insignificant to China's needs. And of course, its raw materials needs as well, and to some extent its energy needs as well. So the Australian relationship is not insignificant in Beijing.